Alright guys, welcome back. We are up to topic 4.12, African Americans in the Early Republic, as we begin to wind down period 4 of the APUSH curriculum. And this is going to be kind of an extension of some things we looked at in a recent video on the reform movements. We talked about abolitionism and some of the motivations, some of the key figures in the abolition movement. And now we're going to focus on the life of African Americans, both in the North and also in the South. So let's talk about this. We're going to look at our guiding question here. It says, what factors influence the experiences of African Americans from 1800 to 1848? We're going to first look at the experience of a free black population. First we'll talk about free black population in the South, and then we'll look at the North. So by the time the Civil War is just about to get started in 1860, the free black population in the South was about 1/4 so about 250,000 in other words. Many of these would have been part of the mulatto population. Remember, mulatto is a term we use for people of both white and black ancestry. Oftentimes this is the result of a union between the white master, or maybe a hired person who's white, and a female slave. And so these people obviously are kind of caught in between two worlds, right? The white world and the black world. And sometimes they were given freedom just because of that. Now, it could, one example could be a slave owner who had children with one of his slaves. Obviously, these are his children. He can't recognize them fully and given the society that he lived in, but he might still feel something of responsibility for them, and so he might decide to emancipate them either then or in his death, his will or something like that. Other free black population would be the result of slaves being able to purchase their freedom. Now that is something that's going to become increasingly less likely as we get closer to the Civil War. But there were some avenues for slaves to earn money, and some avenues for them to then purchase their freedom or the freedom of others. Again, that's a small number, but it did exist. So let's think about the challenges facing your free black population in the South. And challenges, of course, there were many. There were, even if you were not enslaved, there were, you didn't have full equality, obviously, in Southern society as a free black. There were certain job opportunities closed to you. If you had to, if there was a court case you were involved in, you could not testify against a white person in court. There's always the real persistent danger that you could be kidnapped and put back into slavery. And then, what are you going to do? You can't testify on your own behalf, so you were pretty much stuck. There was also just this constant pressure being applied to you by those who defend slavery, because one of the main defenses of slavery was that African Americans were inferior and therefore they had to be controlled. And then if you have a group of people, in fact, independent and living their own lives and surviving and thriving, well, that of course throws your whole argument out. So people who wanted to defend slavery would point to the free black population as something that needed to be basically just kind of pushed out of the way, because it's a dangerous proposition to have free blacks in an enslaved system in the South. All right, now let's look at the Northern population. And what we're going to see is, of course, Northern African Americans faced a lot of challenges of their own. So in terms of numbers, it's about the same in the South and the North prior to the Civil War, about 250,000. In many localities, they were denied suffrage based on their race. In many localities, their children were barred from public schools. So they're certainly not getting a warm welcome in a free state. There's also the issue of tension. So groups at the bottom of society, particularly recent Irish immigrants, they were in economic competition with free blacks because, again, both are, kind of at the bottom rung of the economic ladder, social ladder. And so there's some tension that can flare into violence and hatred between Irish and the free blacks. All right, now let's go back to the South and look at the plantation system itself. And here we are looking at sort of a typical plantation, a very large plantation that would have been located in Georgia in sometime in the antebellum period. Notice how the plantation is arranged along a river. The river, of course, allows the import and export of goods straight from the plantation. Notice that in this particular plantation, they've even built a canal that encircles the plantation. So this allows, boats to go up and around. And then you can see kind of the arrangement. You've got the different fields, cotton and corn being grown primarily. And then you've got different homes up here. Here's another view of sort of a typical plantation. And you've got slave quarters over here. The main house, a second house, a kitchen. No, the kitchen that's detached, one of the main reasons for this is the danger of fire. When you're cooking, of course, you're using flames, and that if a fire were to break out, you would rather it consume the kitchen than the entire house. The plantation was designed to be largely self-sufficient. So you can see you have a blacksmith on property. You've got food crops, cash crops. You've got you even have your own basically like chapel or church, one for the slaves, one for the family. So all told, by 1860, there are about 4 million slaves in the South. Collectively, it's been estimated that would have been worth, the slave population would have been worth about $2 billion in 1860 dollars, which was an incredibly huge number in 1860. So a very valuable source of wealth, if you want to call it that, for the South. In terms of concentration, the slave population is going to shift westward. So we look here at 1820. You can see heavy pockets of slavery, and then lower areas. And then by 1860, again, the year before the Civil War, you'll notice what's happened is the slave population is heading further west. This right here is going to be known as the Black Belt or Cotton Belt. The most densely populated areas in terms of enslaved people and raising of cash crops. Now, a key component of slavery, of course, is the dehumanization process. To not think of slaves as people, but as something lesser than humans. And you see evidence of this in some of these artifacts. This, of course, is something that would have been worn around the neck. So if a slave were to try to escape, the jangling bells here would give away their position. Here, these are basically like ID tags. These are horrific to think about, but these are brands. The branding of slavery, much like cattle, are branded to identify and claim what these people would have seen as property, but of course are human beings. Now, there are, of course, countless tragic aspects of slavery. One in particular that was just horrific in terms of emotional pain would have been the separation of families. And so at a slave auction, it could be that child is sold but mother is not, or vice versa. Or it might be husband is sold and the rest of the family is not. There's obviously all kinds of combinations in here. That would have been absolutely horrific, and I can't even, as a father of two, I can't even wrap my mind around the idea of losing a child or a child losing a parent in one of these auctions. There's also the inhumanity of the inspection of slaves, requiring them to jump and dance and to check their physical abilities, looking over their teeth and eyes, and it's again it's horrible to think about in the modern perspective. But this was the system that dominated the economy of the South. Purchasing and selling slaves. Right? Again, this is something that in our modern day is really hard to wrap your mind around. Now, there is no standard I can give you that says this is exactly what slave life was like. After all, there are 4 million enslaved people in the American South before the Civil War. Everyone has a unique story. Conditions were, extra brutal some places, less brutal other places. Regardless of that, though, we can definitely come up with a sort of a standard that says life was difficult, extremely difficult. Your marriages are not legally recognized. They can be broken via slave auctions. You have no civil rights as an enslaved person, and you have a lifetime of exhausting work ahead of you with no pay and no real benefit from your labor, and of course no ability to choose your own destiny. To have your life chosen for you is a very demoralizing thing. Physical punishments were common, and this was a way of trying to punish slaves for breaking the rules, or as a means of intimidation, of course, of other enslaved people. Just brutal stuff. Now, in terms of religion, there were in quite a few places in the South, there was sort of an encouragement of the practice of slave religion. In other words, having slaves practice Christianity, in the hopes that it would kind of keep them a little bit more docile and less resistant. In terms of slave preaching, you would have seen an interesting mix of Christianity, but also some African teachings and beliefs that have been brought over by ancestors and passed down. There was also a deep emphasis on the story of the Israelites, because of course the Israelites, the story of Exodus is them leaving enslavement in Egypt and heading to the Promised Land. Of course, this would have been a very inspiring story for Southern slaves. Now, in terms of education, it was basically non-existent. We estimate about 90% or so of slaves were completely illiterate. The other 10% would have, maybe know a little bit here and there, and then only a tiny percentage would have been literate, because in many localities, in fact, it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. And one of those reasons is, of course, the fear of slaves having the ability to communicate and then plan some sort of rebellion, which brings us to probably the most famous slave rebellion in American history, the Nat Turner Rebellion that took place in Virginia in 1831. So Nat Turner was a slave preacher who had these visions of a slave uprising. And the story goes that there was an eclipse in 1831, and for him, this eclipse was sort of a sign of, that the time has arrived. And so he organizes this rebellion. 55 or so white people were killed in the Turner Rebellion. Ultimately, the Turner Rebellion does fail. And led to just some really brutal reprisals where enslaved people were killed as punishment, but also as sort of a lesson to other enslaved people that resistance will be punished severely. All right, so we have covered at least the basics of some of the experiences and what factors influence the experiences of African Americans from 1800 to 1848. We began our look at the free population in both the North and South, and then we moved on and we looked at plantation slavery. We looked at some of the brutality and some of the tragic features of slavery, and we finished up by looking at a slave rebellion that, while unsuccessful, certainly did leave a lasting mark on the South. That would be a Nat Turner's Rebellion. All right, guys, so we are almost there. We have one more section, one more topic to go through, and then we will be done with topic 4, Unit 4, I should say.